Hi, welcome to the Trauma and Resilience Podcast. I'm Ricky Robertson. Today, our guest is Dr. Aranda Jayawikrama. Dr. Jayawikrama is a professor of psychology at Wake Forest University. Aranda, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Ricky.
So much of your research focuses on well-being and also ways that people grow from adversity. Would you briefly tell us about the research that you do and some of the things that you've uncovered?
Yes, so I am a personality psychologist by training. So what that means is that I'm interested in understanding the nature of persons, how we're similar to each other, how we're different from each other, and what explains those differences. And my research is focused, I would say, in three areas. As you mentioned, Ricky, well being. I'm very interested in moral personality, or trying to understand morality and how we behave in moral ways from a personality psychology perspective. And I'm also interested in this idea that the experience of adversity, of trauma, of different types of major life events that can impact us significantly can lead to changes within our own sense of self and within our own personality. And I would say that my research in post-traumatic growth is very much influenced by my childhood in Sri Lanka. So I spent the vast majority of my childhood in Sri Lanka, and during the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of ethnopolitical violence as a result of the long-standing civil war in the north and east of the country, as well as an insurrection where a Marxist group tried to overthrow the government in the late 1980s. And as I got older, as I was growing up in the context of all this violence, I was interested in and fascinated in this idea that, given all these terrible things that were happening, people were still finding a way not to thrive, but to manage and fulfill their everyday responsibilities and get on with life. So when I was fortunate and privileged enough to come to the United States to go to college and then subsequently to graduate school, I was interested in resilience. But the longer I stayed in the United States, I got interested in this idea that a lot of Americans would talk about, which was bad things can have good outcomes, or bad things can help you grow. And it was during my time in graduate school that I became interested in post traumatic growth. So I have spent the last 14 years of my research career trying to understand what post traumatic growth is, how frequently do people experience it, what the quality of the research is. So, can we trust the research, which is particularly important in our current age of open science, whether we can trust some of the scientific findings coming out of the social sciences. I have examined this question in the United States, in Sri Lanka, in other countries impacted by political violence.
If I'm listening and I've never heard, for example, the term, post-traumatic growth, would you just for a second just kind of unpack what is that?
So post-traumatic growth refers to the positive psychological changes people experience in the wake of going through a stressful or traumatic or adverse life event. And in psychology, this idea that people can grow through adversity gained currency maybe in the mid 1990s, where there were different groups of researchers who started doing research on this idea that people can experience benefits. The most well-known theory of post-traumatic growth is that of Richard S. Key and Lawrence Calhoun, and they talk about people potentially growing in 5 domains. So they can experience an increased appreciation of their life following adversity. They can experience an increase in their religious or spiritual beliefs or faith. They feel an increased sense of personal strength. So they feel like, oh, I didn't realize I could get through this terrible event, but I got through it somehow. There is increased appreciation of relationships. So, either in terms of centering the value of relationships in your life, or being made aware of the importance of having close friendships, close relationships around you. And finally, this idea that even though the experience of adversity can lead to one door closing, it can lead to the opening of other possibilities. So the idea that going through the event opens up new avenues for your life. So in a lot of research examining post-traumatic growth, those are the 5 domains that researchers are typically focused on.
There's some folks who experience post-traumatic growth after an experience of trauma or significant adversity, and others who do not,
an important question that comes up is, how do we know whether some people have grown while other people haven't, right? So a large proportion of people, like at least 50% or even more, will report some degree of growth on one domain, one of these five domains. Now, much of the research that examines post-traumatic growth tends to ask people, well, after this event, how much do you think you have changed on these dimensions, right? So, the
Mm-hmm.
number of questions for each dimension. And the idea is that you then respond by saying, oh, because of a traumatic event, I think my priorities have shifted or have become more religious. And, from a lay perspective, right? It seems like a really intuitive way to ask the question, right? It's like how you would talk to a friend. Oh, this bad thing happened to you, but do you think you become more religious, or do you think you appreciate your friends more? So it's a very what we psychologists call, it has very high face validity, right? You're asking people, do you think you've grown?
Yeah.
Now the problem there, right? And this relates to this question of whether we know how many people grow or not, is that when you're asking people how much you think you've changed, you are assuming that people can accurately go through the steps of thinking, okay, how is
Mm-hmm.
my past self? How is my present self? What's the difference? And
Mm-hmm.
critically, how much of that difference is due to the adverse event?
Mm.
So, what people are doing is that they're trying to tell you what they think has happened to them. Now, from the perspective of understanding maybe the stories people tell about their lives, or how they make sense of the event, it's not an unreasonable way to assess, to ask a question. But you're interested in the question of whether people can experience growth through adversity. Um, it's not a particularly helpful or valid way, because for at least two reasons.
Yeah.
One is that if I give you a question that, you know, goes along the lines of how much you think you grew because of the trauma, the
Yeah.
assumption behind my question is that
Is
you
that I
grew to some
grew?
extent.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
a leading question, right?
Yes.
Um, so the problem there is that, people might feel compelled to give you a positive response. They might think, oh, given what the question has said, people are supposed to grow. So if I'm going to give a response based on what I think how the average person grows, right? So they may be working through, okay, what's the appropriate response, rather than telling you what they honestly feel. But I think the second reason why this is a problem, and this has to do, I think, with this relates to my own experience coming to the United States for college. There seems to be a narrative around how we talk about trauma, at least in the United States, where the expectation is that when something bad happens to you, it is for you to make something good out of it, right? So,
Mm.
we call this a redemption narrative. Dan
Yes.
McAdams, who's a very eminent personalized psychologist, has written extensively about this. So the idea is, when something bad happens to you, we're supposed to find some way to overcome it and move on and maybe improve. So there might be cultural norms around how we talk about trauma. So when I tell you, let's say, Ricky, you and I go out for a chat, and I'm telling you about something hard that happened to me, and I tell you about this bad thing happened to me, but at the very least, I understand what's important to me now. I'm gonna make changes in my life. I feel like I have a new direction. Now, it might be that I'm still suffering. It might be that I'm still in denial. But when I'm
Mm-hmm.
talking to you, I feel like, well, there's a way in which I'm supposed to talk to you about my experience. Um,
Mm.
so the reason why I bring up these reasons is that it's actually not clear from the research whether we can say with certainty whether most people, some people, any people really grow grow in these ways in the wake of adversity.
Yeah, I mean, I have to imagine it's got to be incredibly complex because beyond those five domains, there's so many other ways that people could either experience growth or experience suffering or
Mm-hmm.
both at the same time. And I think about the body and the physiological responses to trauma and
Mm-hmm.
things that could continue to remain in terms of symptoms of trauma and adversity. And also, I really appreciate what you said about the expectation, which I think can be so harmful,
Mm-hmm.
that folks should frame a traumatic event in a way that always highlights how they overcame it, rather than sometimes being with the vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes more authentic experience of acknowledging one's suffering or one's grief. Um, and that sometimes resilience doesn't look like I overcame it. Resilience could be like I asked for help when I
Mhm.
needed it, right?
I think you're exactly right, Ricky. And what you said reminded me of some of the interviews I've done in Sri Lanka with survivors of the civil war, where
Mm,
once you talk to a few of these survivors, you realize that there's something almost perverse about asking them, how did you overcome this, right? How did you sort of
yeah.
use this as a springboard? Because these are people who have gone through multiple forms of war trauma.
Mm,
And and they still function. They're still able to take care of their families. Not all of them. Some of them do struggle, but that comparison in my mind really highlights how, in many cases, it seems almost like you're committing some form of injustice, right? When you're talking to someone who's gone through adversity and trauma, and there's an expectation that, oh, you're going through this
yeah.
terrible thing, but not only can you be resilient, but also there's this possibility that you can sort of make something of it and what do you call somehow grow, right? Or be better off than you were
Yeah.
before.
Are there things that you have found that do support the well-being of people who have experienced a traumatic event or significant forms of adversity? So are there factors that you have found, or maybe mindsets that you have found, or things that have been a benefit to people to support their well-being in the aftermath of trauma?
So, one thing we have found in many of our studies, and I should note that a lot of the research we do, these are prospective studies that track people over time, so
Yeah.
we can understand how they were functioning before the adverse event and then after the adverse event. And as a result, like, we know how people do over maybe a period of 1 year, but
Hmm.
we haven't been able to track people over longer than that, right? So all the research I'll be talking about really focuses on people's immediate and short-term responses to adversity. For many people, the majority of people, they tend to be resilient in the face of adversity, right? So when you track
Yeah.
when you track people over time, when people experience different types of major life events,
Yeah.
for the most part, they seem to experience maybe short-term decreases in a feeling of self-efficacy or a feeling of personal strength, which, if you think about it, pretty normative, right? Like, in the immediate aftermath
Hmm.
of going through something stressful, something that impacts your everyday life, you might struggle to regain a sense of control over your life. But then, on average, many people recover and they revert back to their um, original levels of well-being. Now,
Mm,
there are some important things to keep in mind here. One is that your pre-existing personality matters to some extent. So if people who are high in emotionality, right, or what some uh, personality psychologists call neuroticism, uh, people high in neuroticism tend to experience greater negative shifts in their well-being in the wake of going through major life events. So
yeah.
they're more sensitive to being negatively impacted, and those shifts in well-being do tend to persist.
Hmm.
So unfortunately, people high in emotionality tend to be at a disadvantage.
Hmm.
Um, in addition, one way in which these events impact your everyday life is that they shape how you experience your everyday social interactions, right? So, for example, if I were to go through a major negative life event, I would
Mm,
subsequently maybe not have particularly positive social interactions with my family or my friends, or I
yeah.
may not enjoy the positive social events that I experience, right? So, one way in which these events can impact us in the short term is that they shift our everyday experience. And I think this has some implications for maybe how we can build resilience or how we can respond positively in the immediate aftermath of going through a major negative life event. Because to the extent to which we can find ways to connect with people, right, to
Hmm.
maintain these relationships, even in the immediate wake of adversity, that is one specific way in which we can maybe lessen the immediate impact of uh, those negative life events.
I think that's really valuable, what you just shared about the power of supportive relationships, because
Mhm.
so many educators can provide those relationships to their students, especially students who experience significant adversity or traumatic events, and really understanding how powerful those supportive relationships are to
Mhm.
support that young person's well-being. What suggestions or advice do you have for someone who may be suffering, because of experiences of significant adversity or trauma,
Mhm.
for ways that they could begin their own healing journey?
I think that question gets to this wider debate that's been going on in philosophy, in different religious traditions, about why there's suffering in the world and how can we make sense of suffering and lead valuable, meaningful lives, right? Despite the truth that there's suffering in the world and that we all have to encounter and grapple and reckon with it at some point. Now, I've written extensively about my criticisms of how we study post-traumatic growth. I've criticized the term because it implies a very simplistic, well, when bad things happen, you can end up in a place where you're somehow better than before, right?
Mm.
Whereas if you read different philosophers, you read how different religious thinkers have spoken about adversity, the idea is that it can teach you something or it can provide you with a widening of your human experience, right? Through the
Mm.
experience of compassion for other people, compassion toward yourself, appreciation for what you have control over in your life compared to what you don't have control over in your life. So, just taking a step back, one of the challenges with how we talk about, resilience or post-traumatic growth and mental health these days is that this assumption that it's all in your control, right? If you do
Yeah.
the right thing, if
Hmm.
you have the right attitude, if you take the right steps, then you can be happy. And I think
Yep.
it's very dangerous when you apply this to the question of adversity, because
Hmm.
then the idea is that, well, this bad thing happens. If I have the right skills, if I have the right attitude, if I take the right action, I
Yep.
can make something out of this. Whereas the
Yep.
truth is that what adversity and suffering teaches you is that you don't know how it's going to impact you, right?
Mm.
Only you're only going to know in the future how something traumatic or something that's had a major impact in your life is going to impact you, right? So you don't know whether it's going to ultimately impact you for the better or for the worse. And also, you don't have a lot of control over it. You have some control. I'm not saying that we are all completely without agency, but I think we, especially in the modern age of self-help and this focus on positivity, we sort of lose the fact that, well, there are some things we don't have control over.
Yeah.
So I think in response to your question, try to find this balance between understanding what you can control in your life and
Mm.
accepting what you can't control or accepting maybe what has happened in the past and trying to find this sort of yin and yang between what we call primary and secondary control, right? The fact that there's some things in your life that you can control and that you should try to have control over, because to the extent to which we feel we have control over our environment, we tend to have better mental health. But also, if there are other things we can't control in our lives, trying to find a sense of acceptance, right? And that we shouldn't keep struggling with this fact that, maybe we have people that we love or family members or love or friends who are struggling with issues, right? In some cases, maybe accepting the fact that those people are struggling, that they might need our help, but we shouldn't put too much of a burden on ourselves that we can fix the problem, right? In some ways, that can open up new solutions and new possibilities. But I really do think that part of the reason why we struggle with adversity is that we believe we can fix it, right? That there's a
Oh,
way that we
thank
can
you.
we can
Yep.
solve the problem and we can make adversity go away. Whereas if
Yep.
you read what most philosophers and most thinkers have had to say on this topic, I think a key insight is that there's some degree of acceptance of adversity and suffering as part of what it means to live.
But there's something really powerful about what you're saying, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong though.
Mhm.
It's not suck it up and move on. It's not pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's not to deny the
Mhm.
suffering. It
Exactly.
is to actually accept it
Hmm.
with a degree of compassion
Exactly.
for the self and one another. Resilience and conversations like that, or post-traumatic growth, etc., or grit, or they're used to shame the person who's suffering or
Exactly.
struggling,
Yeah.
and not to acknowledge sometimes the incredible strength that some people exhibit just by staying alive another day.
Exactly. So this is an excellent point, Ricky, and I think it highlights. I think one thing that might have happened in contemporary culture is that we've taken, there are these extraordinary stories of people who have survived the Holocaust or survived, terrible oppression and trauma, and you see like how growth is manifested through their subsequent lives, right? And those are extraordinary stories which give us hope, right? So maybe
Yeah.
when we are struggling, we can think, well, the fact that some people can overcome this and have meaningful lives, right? Despite the fact that they probably felt the same way I did at some point, that can give you hope. But I
Yep.
think once you make those stories ordinary, right? Once those become like, oh, we all should aspire to be like that person, and I'm going to tell you, you need to aspire to that person if you're going to grow, if you're going to sort of
Yes.
successfully what do I call manage and overcome this event, right? I think that's where the slippage happens.
Mm.
Because I'm not saying that people don't grow, right? I think there is hope in those examples of people who do overcome adversity. But I worry a bit that by making that the norm, the expectation, it both places an unfair burden on people, a really unreasonable burden
Yeah.
on people. But you can imagine how it can make us more tolerant of suffering in society, right? That by assuming that people can grow, we can look at people who are less privileged than us, right? And say,
Yeah.
well, they're going through that bad thing, but people grow from it, right?
Yeah.
So maybe there's some way of to having them go through that experience. There is research suggesting that one reason why people believe other people can grow through adversity is because they want to believe that they live in a just world, right? So
Mm.
it's a attempt to rationalize the fact that they see suffering in the world.
That can become a form of denial, of
Mm-hmm.
aggression, of resentment of
Mm-hmm.
other people who are suffering because of a fear of confronting your own suffering and vulnerability. So there's something kind of about not both compassion and humility and the
Mm-hmm.
way that suffering and adversity can humble us even if we haven't experienced it ourselves, right? We can be humbled by, I think, our place in the world, and that invites us maybe to be more gracious and to offer others more grace.
I think you're absolutely right. You know, this idea that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? So this is Friedrich Nietzsche's
Hmm.
aphorism in
Hmm.
Beyond Good and Evil. I mean, people disagree as to whether he meant that sincerely or not sincerely, because the aphorism starts from life school of war. What that doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? So it's not obvious
Yeah.
whether he's like, being ironic or not. But I feel like the fact that that's become a dominant meme in contemporary society, right? That
Hmm.
it's in pop
Hmm.
songs, people use it as a
Hmm.
mantra.
Yep.
I think one of the challenges, well, I won't say it's a challenge, but the idea that you can vanquish suffering is a relatively new idea, right? Um,
Sure.
for the most part, until maybe 100 years ago, the idea was that suffering was a part of life and we had to live and manage with it, right? That's one of the core insights of Buddhist thought, for example.
Yeah.
And, I think one of the challenges with seeing adversity or trauma or suffering as something to be vanquished is that for those of us, many of us who are privileged enough to be living the lives that we have, many of us in the United States, it imposes distance, right, between us and the people
Yes.
who are suffering. And it
Yep.
gives us this easy framing for, you know, suffering is such a terrible thing, but we can overcome it, we can fight it.
Yep.
So I agree with you that to the extent to which we can maybe open up our eyes to the experience of many people around the world, right, who don't have the luxury to think
Yep.
about adversity as something you can just vanquish or get or move past. There are lessons to be learned from going through adversity, maybe not lessons that we think we're going to learn from it, right? So it's not going to make us stronger.
Hmm.
It probably won't make us stronger. It's probably going to not give us the opportunity to become the best version of ourselves. But it can teach us something important about who we are as people, how we should relate to other people, and what the nature of human existence is.
One of the questions I'll get from educators is, what do I do when I have a student who's struggling and I think there might be something going on at home, or I think they might have experienced some form of trauma or an adverse childhood experience? You know, what do I do to get them to tell me what they've experienced, or should I even be trying to get them to tell me what's happened to them? And so these educators are kind of in this space of, I can tell something's wrong,
Mhm.
but how do I show up and support that student, and do I need to know the details of what happened in order to best support them? And just kind of, some of those educators are just looking for the first step
Mhm.
in that process to be a source of support. Do you have any advice for them?
In my view, is that you have to, work on having the best possible relationship you can with the student. So as an educator, you work to build a trusting, engaged relationship with the student so that they feel that they can trust you, they can reach out to you if there's a problem. I think creating easy pathways for them to contact you and talk to you and connect with you if they feel open to talking with you is important. So I don't know how easy it is for educators in different schools to be able to find one-on-one time with their students.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
maybe there might be a way in which the student could feel comfortable reaching out over email or through an online portal. I do think that what we can do as educators is to create a strong foundation for a trusting relationship with our students, and make it easy for the students to reach out to us. Make signal to the students that we're there for them if they want to talk. We're there for them if they want to share anything with us. But you can't force students. Like, students will not talk to you until they feel they're ready or until they feel they can trust you. Even if you have an inkling that a student is struggling or who might benefit from a conversation, I don't think you can do that until the student themselves feels that they feel comfortable and open talking to you.
I want to kind of ground this in practice. A lot of educators will be listening to this conversation, and I'm just curious, do you have any suggestions for them on just some ways that they can support? We kind of talked about first the self, like recognizing what you can control and what you can't, and kind of having that perspective and offering yourself, I think, some compassion and grace. But then in terms of educators who are supporting students who might be experiencing trauma or significant adversity, any suggestions you have for them?
To the extent to which educators can work with them and maybe move them away from a simplistic understanding of this bad thing happened, but you can overcome it, you can become stronger. And maybe acknowledge the fact this is a challenge. We all go through challenges, right? And we all find a way to overcome it. So I think there are ways in which we can talk about adversity or failure or challenges in a way that simultaneously makes the student feel like, okay, there are some ways in which I can address this. There might be other ways in which I can't, and that's okay, right? So they feel like they're most empowered to think through and work through the adverse event, while also not putting them under pressure. Not using the language of, well, everyone goes through bad things like this. Everyone struggles. You have to figure out a way, right? So to the extent to which you can work with students such that they simultaneously feel empowered but not overwhelmed, right, by the task of sitting with and working through the event. One therapy technique we've gotten a lot of insight from is acceptance and commitment therapy. So the idea that when something bad happens to you, it's fine that you feel bad, right? You accept the fact that you feel bad, but you also acknowledge the fact that how you feel about the event is distinct from your overall sense of self. So there's the you with your values and your goals, and then there's a you that has this emotion experience, and your emotion experience doesn't constitute who you are completely, right? So in these studies, we've done 2 intervention studies now. We've done a full trial, and we've tweaked it, and we just ran a feasibility study. We have people think about what their goals are. Have their goals changed as a result of going through an adverse event? And once they've identified what their core goals are, what their core values are, we help them set intentions for fulfilling those goals, right? We really break it down. We say, okay, if you want to do this, like if you want to build a better relationship with your partner, if you want to build a friend community, here are the specific things you can do. And we talk to them about what stumbling blocks or what barriers they might face. We have them think about it prospectively and then say, okay, how can we work this out beforehand so that going in, okay, if this thing happens, I have a plan, right? So what's nice about that approach is that instead of reflecting solely on the impact of the trauma or the adverse life event, you're focusing on their values. And you have them thinking about, okay, moving forward, how can I be someone who can move through life, achieving the goals and staying true to my values?
This, for me, is what it means to be a trauma-informed educator. Everything you just described, what you just described for me is the antidote to toxic shame. So many children experience abuse or neglect, and they believe that it is somehow their fault or that it defines all of who they are.
Exactly, yeah.
And that shame can eat away at the soul throughout someone's entire lifespan. If there isn't any ability to say, this happened, this is painful, we can hold that pain, and it is not all of who you are. What has happened to you is not your destiny. And that ability to say, who are you? Because you are so much bigger than this.
Exactly.
And what do you want for your life? That's why I think the conversation around trauma-informed care can't just be what happened to you. There has to be a question even in the moment of, okay, what happened to you and what is getting you through? Even just right now, what is getting you through?
Exactly.
Another, and then beyond that, right? What do you want for your future? Because this does not have to be forever. And then,
Hmm.
and having that relationship to support that sense of hope and purpose and possibility, and also
Hmm.
to just affirm the worth and value of the whole self, which is so much greater than this trauma.
I think you're exactly right, Ricky. And just reflecting on what you just said, I think about, my experience in Sri Lanka and my experience in the US as being like polar opposites, because I
Mm,
think in the US, part of the reason why there's so much centering of trauma, right, and how people think about the impact,
yeah,
how it impacts people's identity, is that I think it maybe compared to other countries, many people, not everyone, like this is like there are definitely communities in the US who struggle deeply with chronic adversity. But I
yep,
think our culture sees trauma adversity as so unusual, right? That when it happens, we almost have to like build a narrative or build
yeah.
identity around it. Whereas I
Hmm.
think in Sri Lanka, if anything, we're moved too much towards like a pessimism where because of the long time history of ethnic violence in Sri Lanka, you almost get like desensitized to it, right? And I'm
Mm,
looking back on my experience, I know I was desensitized to all types of terrible violence just because it was
mm,
every day in my life. So I feel like there is this sort of middle point, right? There's this point at which we
yeah.
can acknowledge the fact that what happened was bad, but it's also, and not to be dismissive, but going through adversity and trauma is a part of life. It doesn't have to define you. We can deal with this and then we can move on with our lives, right? I feel like there's this middle ground we can
Yeah.
find.
I think both of us have kind of circled around this in different ways, is
Mm-hmm.
that while we've talked about individual experiences of trauma, we've also been talking about collective experiences of trauma. And we've
Mm-hmm.
also been talking about the fact that maybe we haven't named it explicitly, but the fact that also this has to do with a community's access to resources
Exactly.
and to affordable housing and jobs that pay a living wage and a,
Mm-hmm.
and a relative sense of safety.
Mm-hmm.
And so, all of these things are important to support well-being. None of this falls solely on the shoulders of the individual. And I just think it's important to name that sometimes explicitly, even though I think we've been talking about it in different ways.
I think that's right. And as a psychologist, I will say in many cases, the best way in which you can improve people's mental health is by providing them with resources. In a lot of my work looking at resilience among Sri Lankan war survivors, one of the main criteria for resilience is people feeling like they have the agency to find basic needs that they can take back to their family. I 100% agree with you that any solution towards promoting individual and community well-being involves not only psychological solutions, but
Yep.
also consideration of what might be contributing to the chronic adversity people might be experiencing.
What you said makes me think of Father Greg Boyle, who founded Homeboy Industries, which is an organization that is run with and by individuals who's been formerly incarcerated or are
Mhm.
leaving, having been gang affiliated, and are now getting access to employment. And it's a wonderful organization, originally founded and based out of Los Angeles. And I've read books by him, and one of his quotes is, "Nothing stops a bullet like a job."
Mhm.
And he just talks about the importance of resourcing individuals and communities in
Mhm.
order to support well-being and healthy resilience.
Mhm.
Are there any books or resources that you would recommend to the audience on ways that they can further their learning about some of the topics we've talked about today?
I'll mention three books, and two are pretty accessible, and they're very different books. So, Kate Bowler, who is a professor at Duke Divinity School, and she's been living with I think stage 3, stage 4 cancer for multiple years now. She had a book that came out a few years ago called "Everything Happens for a Reason" and Other Lies I Learned to Love, or Other Lives I Loved. It's a really good book. She comes from a traditional Christian background, and it's about her experience confronting some of these simplistic ideas we have about how we should manage with adversity. And she does it in a really thoughtful way, which might resonate with many of your listeners. Another book, which is very different from this book, is the comedian Rob Delaney's A Heart That Worked, which is account of his experience when his child passed away a couple of years ago.
Hmm.
It's a very different book. It's somewhat profane, but it is a really good job of explain how we can somehow maintain our humanity and move on without having to resort to simplistic, this terrible thing happened, but I've somehow, you know, grown from it and moved on. They're both very different books, but I think in different ways they get at this fundamental question, right, of how we can live meaningful lives under the shadow of like terrible suffering. For those listeners who are very philosophically minded, there was a book that came out last year called Dark Matters, Pessimism and the Problems of Suffering by, I think, a philosopher who's based in the UK, Mara van der Lut. That I think it's a very much a philosophy volume, but for those of you who are interested in figuring out how different thinkers, religious thinkers and philosophers over the centuries thought about suffering, it's a very, very illuminating read.
One final question, Aranda. What is one way that your work has changed you?
It's a good question. I think I had a particular attitude towards struggle and adversity and suffering when I came to the United States, in part because, as I mentioned, right, I grew up as someone who was protected from the worst of the ethnopolitical violence that was present in Sri Lanka when I was young. I still witnessed a lot of it. And I think I may have had a somewhat, dismissive is too strong a word, but I almost felt like when I heard stories of people suffering as a college student, I would feel like, oh, I know you're going through something bad, but it's nothing like what the people in Sri Lanka experienced. And as more time has passed, I've come to realize, and I've maybe come to acknowledge maybe my own limitations, in that maybe one thing that can happen and one thing we should all be mindful of is becoming desensitized to the suffering of other people. And I've worked very intentionally on sort of maybe moving away from that perspective I had coming from the United States to the US. It's one of those things where I feel like having that desensitization was probably adaptive and helpful growing up in Sri Lanka, was allowed you to somehow make sense of what was happening and move on with your day-to-day life. But it was clearly not, what I call adaptive once I moved to the US. So I think, I would like to think that one thing that has happened over my last few years is working on this research is I've become more empathetic to the experience of people, and more understanding of how these simple stories that we tell ourselves, right, about the deservingness of other people, about people's capacity to grow and become stronger, right? These are all stories that we find comfort in, but we may have to work intentionally to moving past them.
Aranda, this conversation has contributed to me greatly, and I'm sure many folks in the audience will want to learn more about your work, and we will put links in the show notes for folks to learn more about the important things that you are doing to support well-being and also to support the well-being of young people. Thank you so much for this conversation, Dr. Aranda Jayawikrama.
Thank you so much, Ricky, and thank you for all the work that you do.
The Trauma and Resilience series is made possible by a partnership between the National Education Association and WETA. For more information, please visit adlit.org/trauma. Trauma and Resilience is available on YouTube and on every major podcast platform. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to the whole series so you won't miss an episode.